The pace of development in the smartphone space has been explosive.
This is how you turn it on.
In a span of 10 years, we've seen incredible advancements on all fronts. Huge improvements in the performance of the SoCs, better quality components like displays and 4G and 5G chipsets, and of course big improvements in the software running on the phone. Things might have slowed down a little bit the past couple of years since we've reached a level of performance adequate enough for day-to-day tasks, but companies are still trying to find ways to distinguish themselves from their competition. And one of these areas has been photography. According to rumors, the iPhone 14 will have a 48-megapixel camera, and the new Samsung flagship phone will go one step further with a 200-megapixel sensor. But as much as companies would like you to believe that these numbers do matter, in reality they don't. Especially when we're talking about mobile phone photography. A good camera is much more than just a megapixel number or the type of machine learning algorithm running to improve the final image. The ingredients that matter the most is a big enough sensor and high quality optics, none of which really exist on the mobile phone space. That's why any old camera can still beat the latest and greatest flagship smartphones. And to test that assumption, we're going to pit the Panasonic GF1, a 12-megapixel camera from 2009, against Apple's latest and greatest, the 12-megapixel iPhone 13 Pro. Let's go! Don't get me wrong, I don't want to diminish the engineering work that goes into building the cameras of modern smartphones. They are engineering marvels, there's no doubt about that. But unfortunately, photography is one of these areas where size does matter. Bigger is truly better. The bigger the sensor, the more light it can gather, the less noisy the images will be, and the better the low light performance will be. And the same applies to lenses. A lens that can provide minimum distortion and lens flare that will also be able to resolve enough detail for the sensor size will have to have a complex structure that will result in a bigger lens. Bigger at least than what is possible on a phone. This, for example, is GF1's sensor. It's a micro four thirds sensor, which is really small compared to bigger cameras, but as you can see, its size is massive compared to the ones available on the iPhone 13. And here's a relatively compact lens for the GF1. It's a wide lens, and compared to regular APS-C or medium format cameras, it's super tiny. But imagine having that sticking out of your phone. And that's with a small, wide lens. If we wanted to incorporate another type, like a macro, in order to match iPhone 13's capabilities, here's the micro four thirds equivalent. Definitely not the most convenient to have in your pocket. So as you can imagine, the iPhone with its tiny sensors and tiny lenses cannot really compete with a more capable camera system, even if that camera is 13 years old and has a lot of limitations. The GF1, for example, has really bad low light performance, but the images coming out of it still feel more natural than the ones coming out of the iPhone 13. But enough talking, let's first check out one of the iPhone 13's key photo features, the macro capabilities. This is a close-up shot of a Raspberry Pi. On the phone's small screen, this image looks absolutely fine, but of course, if we blow it up on a bigger screen or on a print, it will start falling apart. One of the things that's immediately obvious is the lack of detail on the edges of the image. Initially, I thought that it was a motion blur from the way I was holding it, but even with a tripod, the blur effect was still there. I assume it has to do with the lens and the fact that it cannot resolve the same amount of detail throughout. So it's sharper in the center and blurrier on the edges. And just to make sure, I also checked the winning images of Apple's macro competition, and these have the same issues. The center of the image is sharp, and the further away we go from the center, we start losing detail. In some images it was more obvious than others, but all of them had the same issue. But blurring edges aside, the image has the typical telltale signs of a smartphone picture. There's aggressive sharpening and noise reduction going on, to the point where the image looks more like a watercolor painting rather than a photo. This usually happens when we just use the default file format and let the phone dial in the settings. But I used Apple's ProRAW format, so in theory we shouldn't be seeing these issues. But that was a huge assumption on my part. More on that later on. As you can see, with all this aggressive noise reduction and sharpening, the images look quite a bit artificial. The chips and other parts on the board look like they're painted on. There's so much detail missing, and that's because of the aggressive noise reduction. The image is noise-free for sure, but everything else suffers because of it. It's also interesting to see how these specks of dust are handled. You can tell that this is dust, but because of all the noise reduction and sharpening, it feels more like a pattern rather than what it actually is. It just feels wrong. Now, let's have a look at the image out of the GF1. The difference in image quality and detail is quite insane. The image feels much more natural. There's no aggressive noise reduction going on because we can dial in exactly the amount we want. The raw file has nothing baked in. As a result, we get an image with a ton of detail. Of course, the lens quality plays a big role here as well, with the detail being consistent throughout the image. There's so much clarity that we can even see the imperfections in soldering. On the iPhone image, some of these color variations are not even there. It's really wild to see. But apart from these tiny details, everything in the image is more clear and detailed. The chip, the white lettering, even the traces on the board have a lot more definition. And just to remind you, the GF1 doesn't have a higher resolution. Both images are 12 megapixels in size. We have 4000 by 3000 pixels for the GF1 and 4032 by 3024 pixels for the iPhone 13 Pro. Just look at the traces in this area here. On the iPhone, the area is mostly flat, but on the GF1 we can see the embossing and the variance in color much clearer. The white lettering is also more clearly defined. We can even see the thickness of the paint. On the iPhone, the letters are relatively flat. And of course, the further away we go from the center, the more detail we'll lose on the iPhone. The image is a lot blurrier, and as a result, a lot of detail is lost. The image on the GF1 gets softer as well, but not to that degree. It's a more gradual affair. But even if we move to the center, the noise reduction just destroys everything. On the GF1, we can see that the surface of the chip is not smooth at all, but on the iPhone, all that detail is lost. Everything is smeared, giving the chip a different appearance. The GF1 image is just miles ahead in quality. This image unfortunately highlights all of the weak areas of the smartphone. Optics that cannot resolve enough detail compared to bigger lenses, and aggressive image processing that destroys the details of the image. I don't believe the sensor size is an issue here, mostly because we're dealing with just a few close-up details. But what we also need to keep in mind is that the only good quality sensor on the iPhone is the one used on the default focal length. All other focal lengths use lower quality CCDs. The second test played more to the iPhone's strengths. It used the default focal length, so the sensor was the better out of the three, and was also a low light scene. The GF1 is notoriously bad when it comes to low light photography, mainly because the Micro Four Thirds sensors back then weren't so good in that department. They're still not great since they're small in size, but the newer 4/3 sensors have improved quite a bit. For the GF1 though, anything above ISO 200 will give us a noisy image. If I disable any sharpening or noise reduction, here's how the GF1 image looks like. It's shot at ISO 400 and you can tell there's quite a bit of noise there. But I don't really mind it that much. It feels quite natural and it's not too much in the way. I just wish I focused a little bit better. It's clear that the page on the left is out of focus, but it is what it is. We can still though read the text on the page, so it's not all bad. Now let's see the iPhone image. Here's where I was 100% convinced that Apple's ProRAW format is anything but a RAW file. As you can see, there's zero noise to be found, even though the iPhone shows ISO 640 for this shot. And no matter how good low light performance might be on the iPhone, ISO 600 on such a tiny sensor should give us a lot more noise. So what's going on here? It turns out that Apple's RAW format actually maintains all the processing the phone might do. So if the phone has processed the image with a fancy machine learning algorithms, or if it's reducing the noise, it's going to bake all that processing into the RAW format. By definition, that is not what our RAW files should do. There's no way for us to adjust the image in a helpful way. A quick search on the web validated my assumption, so I'm not just imagining things. Thankfully, we have the ability to capture real RAW, but Apple's native camera application doesn't let us. We can either choose Apple's Pro RAW format or the HEIC format. So we need a third-party application to do that, which at the time of shooting I wasn't aware of. I just assumed that Apple's Pro RAW format was some variation of the RAW format I've used on my iPhone 11. Lesson learned. Now, back to the image. As with the previous photo, the aggressive noise reduction destroys all details. The balcony, for example, has no details at all. Instead, what's left is one unified color. And of course, because of this processing, the image of the music band on the left page looks like a watercolor painting. So for me, the GF1 image looks much more natural. Now, if we apply noise reduction to the GF1 image, it's quite easy to get a noise-free result that matches the one from the iPhone, but because we can dial in the settings, we can keep a balance between detail and noise. With the Apple's Pro RAW format, we're just stuck with what we have. We can only increase or decrease the sharpness of the image, but that's about it. And as you can see in this wooden floor area here, the GF1 image maintains more detail compared to the iPhone. The default white balance of the iPhone is a bit off, but that can be easily corrected when processing the RAW file, so it's no big deal. If I had to choose, I would give the GF1 a slight advantage, but the differences here are not that big. Of course, if I used a tripod for both cameras, I would have had the opportunity to use a lower ISO on the GF1, and I think then the differences would have been much bigger. This image, for example, uses a lower ISO value, and since the GF1 performs better on anything lower than ISO 400, the GF1 image is much more detailed. From afar, both images look fine. The iPhone image might even look sharper. The GF1 has a more reddish tone, and the iPhone has the typical iPhone yellow tone. I prefer GF1's interpretation, but the iPhone image might be closer to real life. I'm not 100% sure though because it's been a while. Once we zoom in though, it's clear that the GF1 has managed to capture some more detail. The iPhone image feels like it has reached its limits. There's a ton of little details that need to be resolved, but the iPhone just can't go all the way there. The iPhone image also feels a little bit too contrasty, but even if we try to compensate for that, I don't think we're getting the nice gradation that is visible on the GF1 image. The red handle, for example, feels much more natural on the GF1. On the iPhone, it feels like it's more in your face. It's punchier and it lacks subtlety. I kinda get the sense that the GF1 has more dynamic range to work with. I might be wrong, but there's a lot of areas where things feel a bit too extreme on the iPhone. Let's take as an example this white screwdriver here. On the GF1, it feels like we're getting quite a bit more gradation. There's a lot more different shades of the same color. On the iPhone, on the other hand, this gradation feels much more abrupt. Even if we try to save some of the highlights, the result is just not the same. Another area I find interesting is the wooden and green handles here. There's a lot more depth and information on the GF1 image. And if we go to other areas like this one here, it's really easy to see that there's a lot more information on the GF1 image. Is the iPhone photo bad? No, not really, but the GF1 image feels much more natural and pleasing. The iPhone didn't fare that bad, but as expected, the actual camera, no matter how old, is still quite a bit better, especially once we deviate from the iPhone's default focal length. Then the differences are much more visible, and that's when using a small micro four thirds sensor. Of course, that shouldn't stop you from using your phone to take pictures. After all, it's the one device that's with you all the time. If there's one thing to get out of all this, is to not believe the marketing hype. Yes, smartphone cameras are good, but we're still not there yet. Even a 13-year-old camera can do better. But what do you think? Am I too harsh? Let me know in the comments below. And I think that's about it for this video. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.